So our topic is why not, so it seemed reasonable in 15 minutes to say, well, why not work towards a better capitalism? That's the kind of thing you can talk about in a quarter of an hour. So I should have probably given a little more thought to my talk, but anyway, I didn't. So what we're going to talk about is shareholder value. The good news is those of you who've sat through my class, you'll be able to fill in all the gaps that I'm going to have to leave to fit my time limit. So I want to talk about shareholder value. I should explain what shareholder value is. So shareholder value, and again, I apologize for the ridiculous technocratic nature of this talk following that amazingly heartfelt discussion, but anyway, shareholder value is a form of corporate governance, as we call it. It's how corporations are run. And over the last 50 years, what we found is that corporations have migrated from what we used to call the managerial model, which was the corporations were run by professional managers in a sort of larger stakeholder environment. And the idea has been that we can make a better kind of corporation, and as a result, a better kind of capitalism if we reorient the firm to not serve those larger stakeholder interests, but to serve specifically shareholder interests. And the idea is that if the firm serves the interests of its shareholders, everything else will fall into place, right? So it's sort of the idea is that the firm maximizes value for shareholders. It will also maximize social goods, and that will create a better economic environment, a better capitalist climate for all of the people affected, people like you and me. And that's great in theory, but the problem is, in practice, it has had exactly the contrary effect, as I hope to demonstrate at least partially for you today. That shareholder value, far from being able to maximize social goods by maximizing the productivity and efficiency of firms to drive value for their shareholders, has actually had a very corrosive effect on the kind of capitalist system in which it operates. And so I think one of the questions we need to ask is, when we think about why not, is why do we not fix this? And I hope at least today to explain why I don't think we've been able to fix it looking back over the last, say, decade, at least since the financial crisis, which created an extraordinary opportunity to rethink the kinds of capitalisms that we want. And I think the reason we haven't been able to fix it is we haven't been able to ask the right kind of question. We are not addressing the question as I think it needs to be addressed. So my limited agenda today will be no song or dance routine, but simply to try and arrive at what the question is that we should ask, and then at the very end, I wasn't lying about the SEC thing, it's true, I might skip that slide. Anyway. So what we find is that in this past little while, that we've moved from this environment of managerialism to shareholder primacy, and what the really important effect here has been, and I'm talking about large multinational publicly traded corporations. The most important impact here has been that the people who are occupying that sort of senior management position no longer necessarily see themselves as stewards of a public trust. The corporation is a public trust, which was the idea of the 19th and early 20th century. Instead, they see themselves as people whose job it is to drive value to their shareholders, what we call the principals, those people who own the corporation. And that shift from seeing yourself as a steward of the public trust to a driver of value to your shareholders has been, I think, the most fundamental transformation in our capitalist economy over the last 40 years, and has given rise to this idea of what we call shareholder primacy. Now, at the same time we've seen that, I think it's no secret that we have observed around the world, whether it is here in Madrid or in Paris going on with the Nuit Debout, whether it was in Wall Street with the in New York with the Occupy Wall Street movement. We saw it also in Tel Aviv. We've seen it in Brazil. The world over, really, we've seen these mass eruptions of protest, of discontent. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people taking to the streets, sort of generating or explaining or articulating a kind of deep malaise, a deep sense that somehow the society that we're living in is no longer working for us. And it can have very sort of specific kinds of flavors. It can be anti-immigrant, or it can be because housing prices are too high, or it can be a protest against Wall Street specific, whatever it may be. But I think the larger background to these kinds of protests is that general sense that somehow the kind of prosperity that our parents and our grandparents enjoyed is now being stripped away from us. And I think there is a lot of truth to that general impression. If you look, and I will have some dreary and boring numbers here for you in a moment, but what you've seen is that over the last little while, there has been a kind of general economic stagnation. And I think one of the ways we can read or the frustration that this has created, one of the ways we can read that is in the sort of emergence of a new kind of terminology, which has taken over the last, say, 6, 7 years or so. And that is the idea of the 1%. So wherever you go to these different protests, whether it's in Tel Aviv or in Brazil or in New York or in Madrid or in Paris or in London, this notion of a 1% seems to be a constant recurring motif. And I think that encapsulates the idea that we're not necessarily, all of us, are benefiting from the kind of economic prosperity that capitalism is supposed to create. Now, as we learned from the Panama Papers, most of the 1% is carefully hidden from view. They have their bank accounts wherever they may be. But there is one group in the 1% who is remarkably visible. And those are the nicely paid chief executive officers and other so-called top 5 senior management at many corporations. These headlines that I show you here today are simply taken from last week on Google News. So what that means is on any given particular day, you can go find in the news, you'll get sort of shocking numbers like this. America's top CEOs 340 times, 800 times more than their workers, et cetera. And so one of the things that has happened is that general sense of discontent has fused together with the notion of corporations, multinationals, greedy, psychopathic corporations being run by greedy executives who are taking home massive amounts of pay while the rest of us barely get ahead. I think this is a kind of a widespread view. My co-national Naomi Klein, for example, frequently says those kinds of things. And so what it does is it places at the heart of the conversation the idea the corporation is a greedy entity and the CEOs are kind of uber greedy agents who are using the corporations in order to pay themselves huge amounts of money while the rest of us do not particularly get ahead. The problem with this, and I hope my slide is correct, the problem is if you can see here that it wasn't always that way. If we go back only 25 or 30 years, you'll see that CEO pay and average worker pay were more or less in lockstep. And it's only since about 1990, as my students will know, it's actually since 1989, but I won't get into that, that this extraordinary divergence has happened. And so what that means is when we see the area or the rise of CEO pay, it is consistent, it is coincident with, in fact, this shift of the corporation away from a managerialist and into a shareholder primacy model. You'd be very grateful I didn't bother with that last slide because that's where it would fall asleep. The good news is, so here we can see, if I take the period of shareholder value and I overlay it on this graph that I stole, you will see that the rise of CEO pay is exactly coincident with the rise of the shareholder as the primary focus of the corporation. Which means, or it suggests, when we're asking the question, why are CEOs, why are senior executives being paid so much more than they used to, what we really should be asking is something not about the CEO, but something about the shareholder. Because it's only with the intervention of shareholder primacy that we see this particular development. And so essentially what we could say is that this massive increase in CEO pay has occurred not despite but because of the rise of shareholder primacy as a way of governing the corporations that are at the heart of our modern capitalist system. So when we look at the shareholders, we have to ask who these people are. And here will be a nice slide, I hope familiar to my students. Here we go. You've seen this slide before. So we ask who is the shareholder, and what we find is the shareholder is the rich, right? And I don't say that in a bad way or a good way. It's simply descriptive. If we look at the nature of shareholding and we eventually tie back the beneficiary of shares, what we find is that the vast majority of shares, 80% of every share that is out there to be owned, is owned by the top 10% of society. And within that, almost half is owned by just 1% of society. So when we think of the shareholder, that's who we should think of. We should think of the rich. They're the ones who are benefiting from this particular development. And it's always been that way. As you can see here in this graph, 1983 to 2010, that the top 1% has had a large majority or large plurality of shares throughout that entire period of time. But what has happened over that same period of time? If the nature of shareholding itself hasn't changed, what has happened in terms of wealth distribution in our societies that's helping to contribute to that sense of malaise? And with the work of people like Joseph Stiglitz and Thomas Piketty, for example, recently it's come into a kind of general conversation, we recognize that our societies are deeply afflicted by unprecedented levels of wealth inequality. We're looking at levels of wealth inequality that will be similar to that of the Roman Empire, which was a slave-owning political system. So whether it look at Germany or Sweden or the United States, we find that over the last 40 years, there has been a massive accumulation of wealth in the hands of a very small number of people. Well, assuming that we're not conspiracy-minded and we don't think that somehow this is the result of a kind of carefully planned Masonic or Illuminati kind of plot in order to further the greedy interests of the 1% as they set up their bank accounts through Panama law firms, how has this happened? How has this happened? The nature of shareholding has remained constant, and yet at the same time what we find is that these people at the top have become vastly more wealthy than they ever were before. And the reason is, and this is what explains the CEO pay, is that the people who own these shares, the people who have always traditionally owned these shares, have over the last 30 years found a way to convince the corporation that its primary mission is to make them money, to make them wealthier. And they've done so at levels of efficiency that are not sufficiently known by the wider public. For example, in the year 2014, the total amount of money returned to shareholders by US public corporations exceeded their total earnings. In a 10-year period, Hewlett-Packard, a very well-run company, returned more money to its shareholders than it actually made selling its products in the marketplace. So when you have a over 100% return policy to shareholders, it's not that surprising that the shareholder would end up gaining quite a bit from these kinds of policies. So the question is, how has the shareholder been able to do that? How has the shareholder been able to convince the senior management to provide those kind of extraordinary returns, to return over 100% of the money that they have made in the marketplace? And what you need to do is you need to make senior management essentially think like you. You need to make the senior management think like a shareholder. How do you do that? That's not easy. A senior manager has worked his way up or her way up through the corporation. She's there, she's got sort of large responsibilities over large numbers of people. How do you get her to set aside those considerations and instead focus solely on the interests of a single stakeholder within her firm? Not easy, but possible, and it comes with a price tag. If you're only paying a few million, maybe that's not enough. But if you're willing to pay out 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, $100 million in stock options and restricted stock, at that point you have created enough incentive so that senior management can find a way to reconcile the interest that she fundamentally owes to her firm, but also to drive value to the shareholders, because at that point she is a shareholder too. And so her interests have now superseded those of the firm considered institutionally, and instead have fit nicely with the interests of the kinds of people represented by my blue graphs up here. And so that's the problem. So when we see CEO pay, that is simply a symptom of the larger disease. It's not that CEOs are any more greedy than they ever used to be. They're just like you and I, right? We're all after our own self-interest. It's that the system in which they're operating has become rigged over the last 40 years. And it's become rigged in such a way so as to produce what I might call a caustic, corrosive, unacceptable, and outrageous development, which is that the firms in many of our societies, not just in the United States, but Canada, Australia, Sweden, New Zealand, and elsewhere, have become wealth transfer vehicles, taking money from those who have less and systematically placing it into the hands of those who have more. And if you run a system like that for 30 years, what would you expect to see? Ballooning levels of wealth accumulation at the very top, rapidly expanding wealth inequality as what is at the very heart of the innovation and economic prosperity that our political system and economic system needs. The firm gets derailed into servicing what are essentially a kind of plutocratic class interest. It is not the job of a firm to be a wealth transfer vehicle from those who have less to those who have more, but that's in effect what it has become. How do we stop this? And the answer is I have no idea. But I have a couple of suggestions, which I can say here in in Spain. If I were in the US, I would not say this because government regulation is always a bad thing. The first is This is, see, there's SEC 10B-18. I told you my talk was going to end on a bang. Everyone likes it when you can bring out Securities and Exchange Commission regulations. That should be rolled back, right? So it's your job now to go and make 10B-18 part of the everyday conversation of people. So you're at dinner, oh yeah, what are we going to do about 10B-18? Well, I really think that's a problem. It actually is a problem because this is the regulation that permitted firms to buy back their own shares, which is one of the preferred ways to return money to shareholders. Prior to 1982, that behavior was illegal. It should be illegal again. And I think the other thing we might want to consider is putting on some kind of a taxation system in order to promote or in order to increase transactional transparency and in order to decrease the level of purely speculative activity, the purpose of which is to make a small group of people very wealthy at the expense of the health of corporations and our larger society to benefit from the kind of innovation and prosperity that we need firms to generate in order for us to live together in harmony. If we can do that, then I think we might be able to work towards a better capitalism. Thank you.